welcome to another episode of Healthy Politics, where we're discussing the eternal intersection of healthcare in the United States and American politics. My name is Nick Karls. I'm the EB, Employee Benefits Compliance Director here at Holmes Murphy. And with me is my esteemed co-host, Dan Bishop, former president of Holmes Murphy, and our longtime healthcare strategist extraordinaire. Say hey, Dan.
Hello there.
Hey. And also with us, we got Nathan Cassin.
Hello.
He's the director of our pharmacy practice, and someone that I would say he and Den are right up there as far as knowledge and intelligence goes. So I'm just here for the laughs today. I'm going to let you two really take it. But no, Nathan is our drug guru. He knows all things pharmacy. And if you've been paying attention to the campaigns, there's been a little bit of talk about pharmaceuticals and coverage for pharmaceuticals. And in past episodes, we've talked a little bit about some of the politics around it, right? How do you pay for it? That kind of stuff. And one of the big reasons why, Dan and I were talking about getting Nathan is Nathan has a pretty interesting take when it comes to the pharmacy industry in general. Because Nathan, I don't know, it was probably a month ago, you and I were discussing this.
Yeah.
And you kind of talked to me about, in your mind, is there a bad guy when we're talking about pharmacy? Because every politician likes to point to one part of it, right? The PBMs, the whatever, and say, if we get after them, we can fix this.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because I think it's really easy to point the finger at the big bad administrators, and largely because I think they are perceived to have sort of no value in the healthcare system, more so just a middleman who's transacting between providers and patients. But that's not exactly true. And they do provide actually a lot of what I'll call private oversight of drug prices in the United States. And so while their practices of PBMs have been questionable and still remain largely questionable, in certain instances, to point them as the sole reason of why drugs are expensive in America is not the entire picture. And so when they get dragged out in front of like the oversight committee or, the FTC report, it's very easy to read into that and saying, if we just got rid of PBMs or completely regulated them, then all our problems would be solved. And we're not listening enough to the other side of the equation.
Yeah. And so let me ask you a question. And maybe this is an impossible answer, but in a fantasy world where all of a sudden PBMs disappear, we somehow make PBMs verboten, right? They're illegal. What in your mind would happen? What would be kind of the consequence or unintended consequence of such a thing?
Yeah. So assuming that we still have private plan sponsors in that world.
Yes. Yeah.
Paying for benefits. I mean, it's easy to look at the rebated system that we have today and say, look, list prices are going up, rebates are increasing. They have to pay all of this, billions of dollars to PBMs in terms of rebates, but let's go backwards in time. And I think that can provide actually a lot of historical value. Is before CVS really launched their exclusions-based formulary, drug manufacturers were basically engaging in shadow pricing, meaning that anytime a new drug that came out, they would look at each competitor in the class, determine not its relative value to the other therapeutics, but look at where they were setting price points and continually break those new price thresholds. And so it's not like, drug manufacturers were necessarily good actors before. I mean, how long on the national political stage have we talked about the rising cost of prescription drugs? This is not a 3-year-old issue. And so we have to also hold drug manufacturers accountable because, and I'm sure Den's going to chime in here in a little bit about drug pricing around the globe too, but, drug manufacturers have been very open that once they sort of price their drugs out to the reservation prices of each country, it makes no sense if you have an average income, of $1,000 a month to come out with a $2,000 a month drug. Who's going to buy that? So you're obviously pricing to the incomes and the affordability of each person. And if drug manufacturers had their way, they would do it to each individual. But once you sort of work that through, that everyone's pricing to the reservation price, where else can you go to sort of make up any differences that you have between your expectations with Wall Street and what your sort of revenue expectations are for that year? You do it in the private market, you do it in the United States. And so without that countervailing power of who is going to keep that in check, That's really the value that PBMs provide.
Got it. So, I mean, for a simpleton like myself, what you're basically saying is that they act as something as a backstop, or almost like a policing, a governor on the drug prices that the manufacturers are charging, because they're saying, wait, you're manufacturing it and you're charging this price, but we know that this other manufacturer is providing something similar, lower price. You want to match that if you want to sell it to our plans. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, it's really leveraging buying power into a single market position. So it's people talk about monopoly, right? And monopoly means where you have one supplier, but you could think of it as a countervailing monopsony, where you're gathering all your buyers into a single buyer. And then I think it was, I don't like to quote so often, but I think it was John Kenneth Galbraith who said that, there has to be countervailing power, right? And so that's where that term comes from. And so that's the countervailing power in the marketplace against drug manufacturers, is that we can't just keep letting new drugs come to the marketplace and at these higher and higher and higher prices without there being any checks and balances in the system. Now, what I will stop and caveat with everything I just said is that PBMs know that game and have abused that game. So because rebates are a large portion of how they make money. And so the real fall down in the system is that the United States, yes, we have access to probably the most access and easiest access to the most innovative and best drugs in the world. The problem is that most of the plans that cover these drugs, not all those drugs are equally efficacious as the existing drugs on the market. So we're almost overly generous with our plan coverages. And I think the rhetoric can get misconstrued to say, well, if we don't get rid of the bad drugs, and there's no incentive to bring the good drugs to the marketplace. And I don't think that that's a very coherent very coherent point, is that just because we lose some of the bad drugs doesn't mean we're going to necessarily lose some of the good drugs.
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the things that has happened in the pharmaceutical space is the same thing that happened in the hospital space when networks started. Because if you think your formulary is essentially your network list for prescription drugs, and there are stakeholders that focus solely on discounts. And so in the healthcare space, the biggest discount's the lowest price. Well, that is not necessarily true. You've got to get down to your net cost. Same thing has happened in the pharmacy space. And I think that's where some of this hyper focus on rebates and the criticism comes from, is the biggest rebate doesn't necessarily mean the lowest cost. It is ultimately the net cost that's there. And I think that's a challenge for our clients sometimes, and for our industry, is to keep that in mind, is that there are stakeholders that they kind of want to hold the little carrot up over here. Look at the discount, look at the discount, look at the rebate, and lose the fact, but wait, where's the money going? And I think that's why when politicians come out and try to demonize the PBMs, it's things like that kind of give a little fuel to that emotion. Maybe I don't trust it because there was a focus on one thing instead of maybe what's just my most efficient cost in the end.
Yeah. Well,
why they need you, Nathan, to get to that most efficient cost.
There you go. That's a plug. No, it's interesting because this is a nuanced conversation, right? We're talking about a lot of the people that are going to listen to this, that are viewing this right now, is they're in the car or listening in the car. They're in the industry, so they probably understand it a little bit, maybe. And then you think about the politicians. How many of the politicians do you think actually have any clue how our healthcare system actually works, or, fully understand the rebate system? I mean, I'm sure some of them that sit on certain committees understand it, right? But there are a bunch of them, I'm sure, that, they don't. And so kind of going back to that theme of, all right, then target the PBM, target the manufacturer, say it's all them, because it's an easy message, and it's an easy message for the public to understand, right? Which becomes an issue.
So, Nick, let's go to the really easy message that's primarily come in this round, come from the Harris-Walz campaigns. That they're in some industries they're going to go get price gougers, and then in the healthcare space they're going to lower the cost of prescription drugs. How?
Yeah,
because I have not heard the answer as to how. Now, the Trump administration, when he was president, had an approach to lower the cost that ultimately was for Medicare. The Biden administration actually followed that exact blueprint, and what the Biden administration passed was what the Trump administration had started. So politically, there really hasn't been a big difference between Republicans and Democrats on this issue, but it seems it's the Harris-Walz campaign this time around that's talking more about how that they are going to lower drug prices. What would it take to do that?
Yeah, there's only one tool, right? And that's an enabling statute. You need to have legislation that then gives the agencies, the executive branch, the ability to enforce that law, right? So they would have to actually pass legislation that said, hey, we are going to set a cap on how much a manufacturer can charge for a new drug. We're going to set a cap, or we're going to impact the way that the PBMs use their rebates, especially when they're kind of trying to bring in new business, stuff like that. And that would be pretty complex legislation, because think about, in all the conversations we've had so far, and Nathan knows this better than we do, think about how many little levers they would have to pull in order to make sure that all of the different loopholes were closed, to make sure that it wasn't going to get challenged immediately in the courts and kicked out, right? I mean, it would be one heck of a piece of legislation. It'd have to have bipartisan support. I don't, Dan, I think you maybe had mentioned this early before we started recording, but it's not going to be part of a reconciliation bill or anything like that. It's not a budget deal. It is pure and simple legislation that would require, 60 votes in the Senate.
Right.
Which, when was the last time we had legislation that got 60 votes in the Senate? I honestly,
healthcare related, I think that was the Affordable Care Act, and it got there by one vote, and that was 14 years ago. Because I think that's an important item, is that through regulatory action and budget action, the federal government has been able to start negotiating prices for Medicare for prescription drugs, because they already set prices for other services, hospitals, doctors, and other things. Now they have implemented their first handful of drugs, and that will expand year after year. But that does not apply to the commercial market. It does not apply to our clients, and that cannot be done through a budgeting act or an Inflation Reduction Act, and those kinds of elements can't do it. It would require specific legislation to grant the federal government the power to do that, and that would require Republican and Democratic support in a major healthcare bill, and that seems like a big hill to climb.
Yeah, it's real quick, Nathan. If you heard a politician talking about the cost of pharmaceuticals and talking about solutions, are there any ideas out there that if you heard that, you'd be like, that actually seems legitimate? Have you heard anything? Have you thought of anything where you're like, that actually seems like something that would be a good idea, be workable in our industry, relatively easy to implement, or anything like that?
Ooh,
yeah, no, it's a tough one. And hey,
I don't know if there's a silver bullet, but what I will say is that, we don't necessarily, like I said, we don't really have an independent review board that reviews how drugs are efficacious against other drugs. And we don't necessarily even attempt to benchmark what those prices should be to determine, this may be worth it over these other drugs if the price was X. Not necessarily to regulate the price. And there are organizations like that, but they lack a lot of power. And so there could be some more substantiation, given by the government, even in Medicare. Now, the other point I was going to make about this last one was that even if, let's pretend that the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, Medicare negotiated price was as successful as they think it is, which it wasn't, is that even if it was as successful as they think it was, it would only exacerbate the problem of higher drug prices for the private plan sponsors,
right,
or for commercial markets, because you're basically just acting as another step, another notch in the negotiation that they're going to have to overcome. And again, it's just going to get exacerbated from them. So I think the U.S. does have power because we're the largest market for prescription drugs in the world. And so to exercise that power is, like you said, would be a whole other animal.
So Nathan,
I like that idea. Oh, go ahead, Dan.
Quick question on, talk to me about how they've been able to take action with insulin prices, a few things like that. Maybe a space where there has been some action.
Yeah, so the insulins have always been relatively cheap. The problem with insulins is that there's usually, two forms. So there's one from actual humans, and then there's synthetic insulins. but they're largely interchangeable with each other. So drug manufacturers who are in the metabolic categories, usually these are like Eli Lilly, Novo Nordisk, Sanofi, is that because they're interchangeable, this is where the rebate game can go wrong, is that they were relatively cheap over the counter for a 30-day, not over the counter, but at the point of sale for like 20, $30. But then over time, as they pushed market share around, insulin's list price grew exponentially, but their rebates grew exponentially. So almost 80%, 90% of all of the rebates or of the reimbursement for those branded insulins was flowing back to plan sponsors. Now, that made them unaffordable for members who, as we shifted to higher out-of-pocket costs through high deductible health plans or co-insurances, that it made it unaffordable. And so what the legislation did was remove the average manufacturer price cap. And it's a long way of saying that if they continued to do that by raising the cost of those insulins, they would have to pay a penalty back to Medicare. And so in doing that, they basically stripped out the rebate game in the insulin category. Now, that's all great. And that's a win for people who are on insulin. But what did all the manufacturers? They didn't care so much because now all those same manufacturers have GLP-1s, and GLP-1 usage doesn't require insulin. So they've just shifted the entire market now to these better products. But at the same time, I don't think we're going to necessarily feel the cost depression. And it wasn't necessarily a cost move because the rebates were still flowing to the plan sponsor, but it didn't necessarily help folks moving off of insulin and onto like a GLP-1 medication.
So let's take the cost of GLP-1s. I mean, that is now becoming a topic that is out there about how expensive these drugs are and how many people are potential candidates.
Yeah, I think
what happens with that discussion?
Yeah, they've been out for a while. The only thing that I will say that, about how we really reduce it. I guess I could go back to another point. The way we could also reduce drug prices in America is we probably need to reform how drugs are brought to market and increase the competition between manufacturers. So making it easier to compete with existing brand products and require, more preferred placement for that competition. So, we're probably not going to see a whole lot of price decreases unless Lilly and Novo get into a big war here in GLP-1s over the next couple of years. But usually the balancing power of threes is we're all kind of waiting for a third manufacturer to jump in the space. And we probably will enter, again, back to the formulary PBM discussions of we're going to pick two, the other one's kicked out. There's three big PBMs. No one's going to get cut out of the market. And then you'll start to see them start to compete. But we're probably 5 years away, maybe, from a third manufacturer from coming into this space and really disrupting it. So yeah, I wish I had another silver bullet for that one too.
No,
I'll go one spot here, Nick. Let me interrupt quickly.
Absolutely.
And go. So if I think back to comments of the existing candidates, again, broadly, Trump has concepts. We'll just leave it at that. That's what he said. But I have seen the video and see her say it, that Vice President Harris, and I think this might have been when she was running for president last time, but it may be more recent than that. When asked about, pharmaceutical brand name drugs and prices, she made the comment, "Well, we'll just yank their patent," and was asked in response to that, "Well, can you do that?" And she basically said, "Well, it doesn't happen because nobody's done it." But that's where we're going essentially. I haven't heard that tone come back since that one comment, but just thoughts on that comment of the government changing the rules around patents, in play or out of play?
I think the way that they litigate, so abuse the patent system to increase the length of the patent. So I think that there's a lot of reform that can happen there. But to yank a patent, that takes away all kinds of incentives.
And that was the direct word, was yank.
Yeah.
It wasn't subtle.
Yeah, that's not a good idea.
Nathan, did I catch a Minnesotan oof in there?
Yeah, you did. You caught a Minneapolis oof.
Oof. All right. Well, I do like the idea, that having some sort of, it wouldn't take legislation. You could probably set up some sort of panel that looked at the efficacy of different drugs and their costs and all that. And then you could post that, you probably put that in with some form of transparency. Something from the CAA, you could probably find a way to shoehorn it in there. And then what you could say is that an employer would want to use that to show that they're meeting their fiduciary obligations to the plan and finding the best drugs at the best price. I like that idea, Nathan. We might have to.
There could also be more. So when like public research institutions that are funded by the government, if they're developing drugs and a certain portion of that is developed with federal money,
well, yeah,
then to privatize the patent doesn't make a whole lot of sense either.
No,
so
that's another good one.
So I think that's another area where there could be more public-private partnership in order to ensure that innovative drugs are not just sort of being sold to the highest bidder, but at the same time are actually benefiting public health and the public good.
Ooh, and with that, my friends, I think we'll call it a day. That was a fantastic conversation. Nathan, thank you very much for joining us today. That was really enlightening. But as we always say, it doesn't have to be the end of the conversation. If you have any questions about anything that we talked about today, reach out to your Holmes Murphy representative. They know how to get in touch with the three of us. They do all the time. And we're happy to discuss this further. But until then, it was nice talking to you, and we'll see you again in the next one.